And thank you for being here as we have our Leadership Exploration Series Session 2. I want to go on camera to say hello to everyone, and then I'll go off camera. It actually becomes a bit distracting when we go through the actual upload for the recording. And so I just want to say hello to everyone and thank you all for being here as we get started with our session today. So I've dropped a couple things in the chat that we will use later in the session. So please feel free to open those files and have them ready as you are preparing for your session today. If you want to drop any questions as we go along into the chat, please feel free to. If you also have questions, you want to go off mute or raise your hand digitally, I'd be happy to answer those questions as we go through our session today. But just know that you have that ability to do that. All right, so we'll go ahead and get started with the main content. We're here for the Leadership Exploration Series Session 2, which is part of our year-long series. We'll have 4 total sessions discussing various theories and approaches to leadership. We hope you join us for this session and future sessions. I want to do a really quick brief recap for folks that may have not attended session 1 or just need a reminder what we discussed in our previous session, but this will get us kicked off. And so in the first session, we discussed trait-based leadership, which was a problematic and rigid early theory of leadership. It's one of the earliest descriptions of leadership. It's often described or referred to as the quote-unquote best man theory, which is problematic on its own. It is some theory that basically describes leadership as inherent to a specific set of traits. The idea that people are born into leadership and that folks will naturally gravitate towards it. There's a lot of challenges and a lot of reasons we would not want to practice this as our primary form of leadership theory. Part of that is because it does not acknowledge leadership as something you can develop. And so from the perspective of us doing these seminars and wanting to encourage you all to explore leadership, it's not a great approach because the idea would be that some of you would be good leaders and some of you would not. And it's best to just only focus on the folks that have the inherent ability to lead. What later research on leadership has told us is that that's not true. Leadership is trainable. It is a developable skill with enough time and attention. And so we like to skew away from trait-based leadership, but it's helpful to understand that concept at the beginning. We also talked about the style approach, which is also an earlier theory of leadership, a bit simplistic, that on its face looks very useful, but when you dig into it is less useful. It is a leader behavior-focused theory, and so it's less about a set of traits that someone possesses and more about how they behave in a leadership situation. Its advantage is that it's easily digestible, but it really lacks limited evidence and its validity to say that it actually works. It basically groups you into one of 4 categories based on the situation you're facing, but 3 of the 4 categories are pretty identifiable as problematic and not good, and it drafts you towards one very specific category that has not been shown to be effective either. It also is a very narrow idea of what a successful leader really is, which again puts it more in the category of specific people will lead, others will follow. And this is not really helpful for us as we're trying to explore leadership. So we generally encourage folks to look away from the style approach as well, as being too simplistic and not being developed enough to help us with our leadership. So that was session 1. In session 2, we're going to talk about some things that you can actually practically apply for leadership that'll hopefully help you be more effective in those environments. But much like session 1, before we get started with that, I do want to take a moment for us to just think a bit about leadership and consider a few questions. First is, how do we describe leadership? And so you want to think about this for your own self. Like, how would you describe leadership if you were writing a brief essay? How would you then describe yourself as a leader using that definition? Do you fit that definition of a leader or do you not? Moving to the practical side, how do you answer the interview question, how do I lead? When someone asks you that, are you able to give a well-reasoned answer that demonstrates your skills, or do you give a real kind of common answer of describing leading by example, or something that's more of a platitude versus really talking about your approach to leadership. And then finally, given all of that information and how your thoughts on leadership and how you respond to an interview question, when the rubber meets the road, how do you actually lead? Is your thoughts on how you answer that interview question actually reflective of the approach that you take in leadership? So that's what we're hoping to move towards, is that you'll be able to answer the question, how do you lead really effectively in an interview, so that you are able to demonstrate your skills and knowledge around that and your ability to work with others, but then also able to put that directly into practice, right? Be able to use those skills. And I'm going to do one quick sound. I know we did a sound check earlier, but as we're getting into the session and we're online, it's harder to tell. Just make sure we're not losing anyone behind. Are we still good on sound? So give me a thumbs up or give me a audio cue that we're okay.
So far, so good.
Excellent. Everyone able to also open up the 2 files that I sent? If you're not able to open them, let me know or drop it in the chat, because we will use those here in a little bit. All right, so while you're opening those up, I'll continue moving through the content again. Let me know if you have any challenges. This is a session, by the way, if you know we're on a digital environment. If you are listening to this session while also working on something else, I would encourage you to focus in on the session. It is one that requires a bit more participation in some areas. We will be doing some questionnaires. Conversation is helpful. And so this is, well, we'll be doing a lot of conversation in like a more lecture style. It does require a bit of attention. So I encourage folks to not divide their time, particularly when we get to the questionnaire portion, so that you have time to work on that and report back on your findings. So our goals so far in this session today is we want to broaden the discussion of how we lead to include dynamic situations. Moving beyond just the one template of what leadership is, we know that our lives are fluid, they're dynamic. You'll be in different groups, different times. Those groups may behave differently. So how do you lead in a different situation? We are going to look at 3 theoretical lenses for approaching leadership in dynamic situations and how you can apply those. And so today we're moving out of what we described as bad leadership and the trait and the style approach into these are actionable things that you can do, and you could sit down and say, this is my leadership philosophy and my theory. So if we work through some things today and it really rings true for you, this is stuff you can then take and research later a little bit more, and that becomes something you practically apply. And so for that, we need to assess our own fit with each of the theories and approaches. There's a lot of similarity between the 3 approaches we're talking about today. They actually all fit under one umbrella, but they have some very significant differences as well. As we go through the leadership seminar series, what I'll talk about also in later sessions is that folks often have multiple theories of leadership they apply for different situations, or they might have, a broad theory of leadership for their entire group, but then have a more narrow, practical theory of leadership for their one-on-one interactions with the people that they're supervising or leading in a group setting. And so as you look at these dynamic situations today, these might be the more practical one-to-one, how do I get into the nitty-gritty of leadership versus like the broad kind of philosophical in your head type of leadership lenses you might apply. So we're hitting the practical side today. The first theory we're going to talk about is called contingency theory. And technically, all of the theories we're discussing today fall under the umbrella of a contingency theory. But there is kind of one that has like the main title for that. And so we'll talk about that one first, and then 2 others that are kind of sub theories that take that idea of contingency theory of like applying to a specific situation and run with it. But contingency theory is a good place to start as the main one. So contingency theory is developed by studying many different leaders in different contexts. And so as opposed to kind of just applying external observations or kind of coming up with on the fly of like trait-based leadership, things like that, the folks that developed it really looked at leaders and tried to figure out why they were successful and what they were doing. So it's a study, in-depth study into leadership that creates this. It is described as a leader match theory, where you're trying to match the leader to the best fit of contexts. This will be where it majorly diverges from some other theories that are contingency theory related, because it's not about changing your leadership style to fit the situation. It's about placing a leader in a situation where they will be the most successful. So as we go through, we'll talk about and show some models where they focus on the style and the situation and the framework. And it helps explain how effectiveness is given within a proposed context. And so again, it's also very predictive. When contingency theory is probably at its strongest is when you're trying to look forward in the future about where you place a leader in a situation so they're most successful, and less about making a change. So it's about giving proposed recommendations. How it breaks down is there are two leadership styles that someone can kind of score on. The task-motivated style and the relationship-motivated style. And then there are three situational variables that someone can then be scored upon. Their leader-member relations, so again, how well they get along with or value those interpersonal interactions and support for their followers. The task structure, whether it's really highly structured or low structured, how much direction they're giving, how much autonomy they give to their employees or their coworkers or their group members. And then something called position power. This one's the more abstract of the three. Position power essentially is how much power and influence or control does the person as the leader have over the group that they're leading. Thinking of this from an employment standpoint, you know, if the supervisor has the ability to hire, fire, or give promotions and or benefits to the employee, they have high positional power. If you're in a situation where you're working with colleagues, you're all on the same level, but you're acting as the leader, but you don't have the ability to remove folks from the group or impose a consequence or impose a reward, you have low positional power. And so it affects how the relationship develops. So using the task motivation and the relationship motivation for the leader, and then the leader-member relations, the task structure, the position power for situational variables, you can develop a recommendation for the best situation for that leader. And so it's a bit complex. I'm grading all those out, but there is a tool that actually assists with developing that. And so again, talking about contingency theory is, you know, really the success of this model is contingent upon the leader's fit with the given situation and the context. And so when we talk about contingency theories, I want us to always hold that in mind, is that our success is contingent upon the fit. In some models, they encourage changing the leader's style, and in contingency theory, it encourages changing the leader based on the context as opposed to changing the style. So what we're going to do now is we're going to move to the least preferred coworker questionnaire, which is a bit of a interesting name for a questionnaire. It's a bit of a misnomer. It does ask you to think about someone that would be considered your least preferred coworker, but you're not necessarily thinking of someone you dislike. It's basically how you describe someone that you have the least chance of being successful with working in a working environment. So if you can open up that LPC questionnaire that you received, we'll take about 2 or 3 minutes. I'll put us on the clock to review this and come up with your score. And then we'll chat a bit about the results that we got. Hopefully folks have had a chance to finish up their LPC and total their score. We'll do here is just a text dump. Just put your score in the chat, your total score. I'll put mine in first. I scored a 41 on the LPC. This is the engagement portion, folks, where you also show that you've been working on the assessment with us. So do we need more time on this?
Yeah, I had to total them up, but I'm ready.
Gotcha. Drop it in the chat when you get a chance. Got a 106. All right. 59. 95. So we're seeing here we have a pretty good mix of folks that are task motivated, independent, and relationship motivated. Some highly relationship motivated, some highly task motivated. So one of the challenges with this assessment is that it's not super clear. It can be a little bit difficult to complete, and that's why I also wanted us to work on it early as we go through this session, to get a sense of some of the pros and cons as we look at the contingency model. So we'll go from here. So we're actually going to look at the example of how this model shakes out and what is successful in contingency model, like the situations and where you may not be as successful. And again, it's a bit of a complicated model when you really look at it. So this is Fiedler's contingency model. This is actually the map of how the LPC is applied. And so it looks at the leader-member relations, this task structure, and the leader position power, whether you have good leader-member relations, high task structure, or strong positional power, and again, the vice versa of those, and then maps that across kind of a graph-in model to determine where people will be most successful. So as you're looking at this, what it shows us is that if someone has a low LPC, which is task motivated, they are most likely to be successful in very favorable situations and unfavorable situations. So favorable being situations where leader-member relationships are good, task structure is high, leader position power is strong or weak. They're also effective in the opposite of that, the unfavorable situations. Folks that have a middle LPC, they're in the independent category, so they're kind of floating between the two, are most successful in favorable situations. And folks that have a high LPC, that are relationship motivated, they are most successful in this broad range of moderate sections where they might be successful. And so using the LPC and having potentially being in charge of making assignments for leadership, you would look at an appraisal situation and say, okay, I have a relationship-oriented individual. They would be good in these moderate situations where they have fairly good opportunity to build relationships with their leaders. The task structure, has some ambiguity, but some flexibility, and they have at least some positional power, right? But if you have someone that is ranking high in the LPC, that is ranking in the, so relationship folks would be good in that middle category. If you have folks that are task focused, you can kind of drop them into, things are really going really well, or things are not going well and not going smoothly, and that's where they'll thrive. But in the moderate category, they will struggle. And so that's how this model is applied. The advantages of using contingency theory is that, one, it's supported by a good amount of empirical research. It's been tested, it's been found to be valid by researchers. And so when you look at this complex model, when you look at the LPC, there is research behind it that shows that there is good predictive quality to fitting folks within these leadership contexts. It seems to work and seems to be proved by research. It's great that it can function in a predictive way. That is very uncommon in the theories of leadership. Typically, they're looking at an overall philosophy or how to change your approach, not necessarily how to predict whether someone's going to be successful, because it looks at the leader as more of a static entity. And it's also good that the theory does not advocate that one person as the leader has to be successful in all contexts. It's really about finding that fit. And so in some ways, it has a bit more of a human quality to it, of it not expecting any one person to be great at everything or find a way to be great at everything. It's about where can you be successful? What is your natural fit? And how do we put you into that environment? And so in that way, it's like Strengths Quest. If you've had an opportunity to take a session like that, it has some themes that are related you could draw from. And again, a little more human quality of it, recognizing that not everyone's good at every single situation. However, it also has some not as great qualities that we also have to acknowledge if we're thinking about contingency theory as our main theory of approaching leadership. So while it's empirically sound, it is heavily criticized. The LPC itself is really confusing. It's counterintuitive. And so it's hard to tell whether or not it's being filled out correctly, if the result is there valid and can really be used for the individual. The model is overly complex, and so it can be hard to find out where folks fit in that model, and it can be a bit rigid. So it's got a lot of criticism leveled against it. It doesn't explain why certain leadership styles are effective in certain contexts. It does very little to explain why someone who is task focused and a low LPC is going to be good in both, situations where everything is going really well and situations where things are not going well. The research shows that seems to happen, but there's no explanation on why. And so without that why, it can be hard to apply. It's really cumbersome to put into practice because it is so complex. And so if you think about this as how am I going to apply this in the work that I do, mapping yourself or mapping another individual onto the LPC scale and the model can be challenging. So you have to really work at it and become really an expert at it. And it doesn't really provide any guidance for an organization on what to do when the leaders don't match the situation beyond saying, move someone. And we recognize that's not always possible. You may find yourself as a group leader or in charge of a division or supervising a group, and that group will change over time, or you enter a group as a supervisor and you don't get to necessarily pick all the contexts, and you can't just pick up and change just because the context isn't fitting your style. And you have to find a way to be successful. And so this model doesn't necessarily give a way out of that. It looks at, can you predict their overall level of success and potential engagement? And so in that regard, it can be less effective. So moving from contingency theory to a related kind of sub-theory that also falls under that umbrella, but looks at a different way of approaching the idea of contingency theory, is the situational theory. And so this is one of the most widely used and recognized approaches to leadership. It's the kind of thing that you'll see often used at like leadership retreats for business, books be sold on it, seminars will be given. And so it's widely used, and it's widely recognized as a pretty strong theory for an approach to using leadership. And it falls into that contingency category, in that you're fitting the leadership to the situation. It's been refined several times since its inception. It has a long-standing theory, and it's evolved over time, which is really good. So it hasn't been static. It hasn't been left by the wayside. It continues to evolve and be practiced actively. It is cited and taught frequently in the business world. And it focuses on adjusting how you lead to the situation presented, right? And so the name is very self-descriptive. You fit your leadership style to the situation. But what that style is and how you define the situation is where it gets into the real meat of the theory. It is described as a prescriptive model. Your approach as the leader is going to fall into one of four categories. And those are based on a high or low directive action and a high or low supportive action necessary from the leader. And so we say high or low directive action. That's how much direction you're having to give to the followers in order for them to be successful, right? Do they need a lot of attention and a lot of direction, or do they need a lot of autonomy? If you have folks looking at the supportive side, how much emotional and personal support do they need to be successful versus, needing less of that personal attention to be successful. And so the theory maps onto those kind of 4 categories. And then it also maps out the followers based on level of commitment and overall competence that they have as the follower. And then as you map out the high and low directive, the high, low supportive, and the level of commitment, and level of competence, that tells you what quadrant they fit in, and we'll show the model and what this looks like. And you move in that approach for that individual. But that can change over time or based on task. And so you might have an individual that has high motivation and high competence in one task, but as you're training on something new, they may have high levels of commitment, but low levels of competence. And so your approach as a leader has to change based on the task this person is doing. As they grow as followers and gain confidence, they also will change in what your approach is as a leader. And this makes natural sense. If you think about leadership and how you would have a long-term relationship with a follower, you'd have to change that approach over time. When you look at this from a visual sense, which really helps articulate this theory, you essentially have kind of this 4-quadrant model, starting in the bottom right-hand corner, where you're going to give directing style actions. The leader decides what happens. This is where you have folks that are low in the competence side, high in commitment, right? These are your new followers, folks that just started. They don't know a lot about the work that's being done, but they're really highly excited to be there and to learn, right? They're motivated folks. And so for these folks, they need a lot of direction. And so you give those folks a lot of the directing action. You lower on the supportive behaviors because they don't need that right now. They're high on the commitment side. They're already excited to be there. You can focus on just task completion, how you get them direction and training. As you move into the S2 category in the orange there, that's the coaching category. That's where you're both highly directive and you're providing high supportive behaviors. And so that's where you talk about the decisions, but you're still making the decisions for the folks. These are folks that are moving from low to mid levels of competence, but they're also showing lower levels of commitment, right? And so maybe they've kind of burned through that initial energy of being there, and they're just kind of getting their feet established. And so they're needing some elevation of their commitment and their motivation. Moving that into the S3 category, these are low directive, high supportive behaviors. This is providing support to the follower. So this is where they're at their moderate to high levels of competence, and their commitment is kind of variable. So they're getting to the point where they're pretty autonomous in the task that's being completed, but maybe they haven't brought their motivation back up. They're not quite sure why they're there. And so you have to give less direction because they know what to do, but you have to give high support so they feel valued in the organization or in the group. And the last category is the high competence, high commitment category. That's where you let the employee, the follower, the group member, you delegate to them. You provide them the opportunity to decide. And so this is they're high competence, high commitment. So you need low direction, and they're also very low maintenance. You don't need to provide a significant amount of supportive behaviors. The individual is already committed to what they're doing. They feel that value already, and so they need less attention in those categories. Some advantages to using the situational theory. Again, it is recognized as a standard method for training people how to lead. If you think about the diagram that we just went through and kind of talking it through, it's really practical and it's relatively easy to understand and apply. If you compare that diagram and that concept of leadership to contingency theory, it's much more practical. It's much easier to digest and figure out, how am I supposed to approach the situation? How am I going to train someone else to lead, or how am I going to get them to be an effective leader? So the situational approach seems to be more practical. And again, not incredibly easy to understand. It's still got some complexity to it, but relatively easy. Once you kind of digested the model, looked at the diagram, and you can kind of talk to an employee, you can figure out where they're at. You have some idea of what comes next. It does provide that really clear set of prescriptive behaviors for leaders to emulate. And so it really gives you almost that paint by numbers. You walk into a situation, you talk to a follower, you find out they don't have the skill that I need, but they're really excited to be here and know what I need to do to help them be successful. I have this individual that's been working here for a while, and they're developing proficiency in a task, but they don't seem very motivated. So they're not developing. I have to provide coaching, right? It's easy to kind of snap a judgment, figure out what to do, enact that, and try to move them to the next phase. And it also gives you that flexibility over time, knowing that people are going to change based on task or just how long they've been working somewhere. And again, it stresses that there's no one way that you have to lead. You have to be flexible and fluid if you want to be successful as a leader. And again, this makes really good sense when we start thinking about it from a real world situation, of knowing that every situation is dynamic. Comparing to contingency theory, where you have the ability to recommends moving people around based on leadership roles and best fit. That's not very practical in a real sense, and situations aren't going to stay static. So situational theory gives you the ability to move on the fly and adjust. However, as you see kind of in the fit and flow of the presentation, how we approach this, we always have to look at what the strength is, but also what are the limitations. And so the situational theory also has some things that are drawbacks. So if we want to apply this as one of our lenses for leadership, we have to know what that is. The first is that there is not a strong body of confirming research. So compared to contingency theory that has a lot of research that shows validity, situational theory does not have the same breadth of research that shows it's confirmed. There's some studies that confirm it, some that kind of indicate that it's limited. And so there's still ongoing conversation around that, which is why the model continues to evolve. How followers move from the low and high development commitment levels is really unclear and is debatable as they move through those different phases. The idea that someone moves from, starting in an organization as being very committed to an organization, but low in the task category, fits in an abstract or a theoretical way, but we know human beings may not always fit that model. You might have someone that starts out and they are low on the knowledge area, but also not really committed to being there. It's just there for a paycheck, or they're not motivated. And as they move through these middle categories, the idea that commitment is inversely proportional to your level of skill, there's not a lot of research that indicates that's how people move through their path in development. It makes those suppositions, but that's also why, again, the research hasn't confirmed this really strongly, because of really though those categories flow together and how commitment and motivation are related to one another inversely. It also, situational theory doesn't really take into account demographical differences in leadership style preference. So some research has looked at how men and women may approach leadership, or what they prefer in a leader, and found that looking at very broad categories in demographics, that a certain demographic of men may prefer one style of leadership, or women may prefer something different. And situational theory doesn't take any of that into account. And so knowing that, again, folks don't always fit neatly into 4 categories is where situational leadership loses some of its utility. So it's a helpful guide. It can help you figure out what you may need to do, but you also might find that the model tells you should provide coaching to an individual, that just doesn't seem to be effective in that situation. And so you have to figure out what comes next. And so that moves us now to our final theory of leadership, that we're going to be discussing today, and this is called path goal theory. I left this one for the end because it's probably the most complex of the three, and so we'll talk through that. It's a pretty interesting one, but can also be challenging to apply. But it is a version of contingency theory that seeks to explain how a leader motivates their followers. And I've mentioned motivation a couple of times in the other sections, but the other leadership theories don't directly tackle the concept of motivation, right? As we look at it from the outside, we can apply thoughts about motivation, but path goal theory directly integrates another theory of motivation, which is expectancy theory, which was developed by Victor Vroom. And then in expectancy theory, essentially the idea is that effort leads to performance, which leads to reward. It's the idea is that as you're working on how you motivate an individual, is you encourage effort to achieve stronger performance so that they're motivated by that reward they receive. That may be financial, it may be an intrinsic award of just a job well done, it may be a lot of things. So reward, again, is abstract. But path goal theory takes expectancy theory and it applies it directly into a leadership model. It is pretty much the only theory that does this. So leader style in path goal theory is based on the challenge present in the work environment. So what are you experiencing in that work environment? Again, path goal theory. So you're trying to help them move around obstacles. What's the challenge? And then what style do you need based on that? And so a directive style is recommended for situations where there's a lot of ambiguity in the work that's being done by a group. A supportive style is recommended for in a work environment or a group environment where there's a very, very repetitive task that is needed. The idea being that it's monotonous and focusing a lot of support to stay motivated in that environment. A participative model and style is recommended when you have a lot of unclear and autonomous tasks that have to be done. And then an achievement-oriented approach is recommended when you have very challenging tasks that need to be completed. And so based off of those four broad categories of challenge, it gives you four different styles of leadership to approach. Along with the challenge present, it also takes into account follower characteristics. And so their preferences and their efficacy of leader approach kind of help determine that. And then it also looks at how the leader helps the follower reach the goal through directing, guiding, and coaching. And so it's got a lot of moving pieces that have to be used in order to effectively use path goal theory. Again, what is helpful is often looking at this in a model sense. And so if you look at this from a model, you have the leadership behaviors that one could practice: directive, supportive, participative, or achievement-oriented, is combined with the follower characteristics and the task characteristics, and that dictates motivation. And your motivation is what helps your followers move through the goals towards productivity. So what I will do now, though, this gives us a good opportunity, we're talking for a while, to take a quick break. I'm going to give us 3 minutes to do the next questionnaire. And so if you want to open up the path goal theory questionnaire, I'll put us on the clock for 3 minutes on this one. So you've had a chance to kind of learn more about what path goal theory is, and you've heard about some of the other theories. Go ahead and fill out the path goal theory questionnaire. This one's a bit more straightforward in that you use a Likert style scale of 1 to 7, moving from never to always, to describe your behaviors in leadership. And then you have to total those up. Do be aware that some are reverse coded. And so take about 3 minutes, answer those 20 questions, go with your gut instinct on the answers, and that will give you your scores for directive, supportive, and participative styles. So I'll go on mute and put us on the clock. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and bring us back on the path goal questionnaire. If you're still working through and doing some of your totals, that's okay. I encourage you to finish those totals up as you have time, maybe later on today. It's always helpful to kind of go through and do the path goal leadership questionnaire to give some context on the model as we discussed it, and give you a chance to kind of really see where this all falls together. As you're looking at the interpretation side, so again, remember that some are reverse scored. That means, for example, for number 7, if you scored yourself on that one as a 3, that score would actually be a 5, right? If you scored it a 1, it would be a 7. But really, you're totaling up those then once you do reverse scoring, and then it gives you kind of that score of directive, supportive, participative, or achievement oriented. If you score a 23 on directive style, that's going to be considered pretty average. If you're above a 28, you're pretty high in the directive category. So it's going to be a natural tendency you may move towards. If you're below 18, you're going to be less comfortable in directive styles of leadership. For supportive, that 28 is about the medium. If you're at a 33, you're high on the supportive style. And at 23, you're going to be more low on the supportive style. For participative, 21 is an average score, 26 is high on participative, and 16 is low. And then achievement-oriented, a common score would be like a 19, 24 would be considered high, and 14 would be considered low. So as you went through, were there any surprises, anything that you were not expecting, or did you feel like your scores have kind of shaken out to where you would expect?
For me, I was a little surprised, especially in the first questionnaire that we did.
Okay.
That I was highly relationship motivated.
Yeah.
That was something that at first I didn't expect, but then when I kind of thought about it, I was like, okay, you know what, that makes some sense.
Yeah. So you found that your assessments are that you are highly relationship motivated?
I think so, yeah. I don't know what else to say, but yeah, that feels like an important factor for me when it comes to working with peers.
Sure.
That, there's a dynamic where 2 people can get something done by working together, if that makes sense.
It does. And I appreciate you sharing on that. Thank you. Yeah, we can find sometimes things that, are a bit surprising. We may not expect that result. Sometimes it confirms, our thoughts, right? I'm always really honest. I'm always surprised at sometimes how low my relationship-oriented scores are, given how I feel I work with individuals. But I also recognize that my task-oriented ones I already know are very high. And so I'm not surprised by that, but sometimes I'm surprised by my relationship ones being a bit lower than I'd expect, and gives just thoughts of how can I move in the future, or am I meeting my followers' needs and my employees and things like that's needs if I'm that low on that category. So it's good to kind of take those self-assessments, kind of step back from it. The assessment also helps you to determine, like, if you're reading through it and the questionnaire just doesn't feel like it rings true for you, or you have trouble with it, it may be a good indicator that maybe this model and this theory is not the one that's going to be the best fit for you as you're looking to apply a theory of leadership, right? And our idea today and our goal is not necessarily to say this is the best version of contingency theory. It's here's 3 very viable options and what seems most likely to be successful for you overall, and trying to run with that and learn more about it. So taking the results and thinking about the assessment and the model and kind of seeing that, we're going to talk a bit about what really are the strengths of the path goal theory as we think about it. And again, it's pretty complex, but there are a lot of really good things that it can do for us. One is that it expands leadership to 4 dimensions beyond just task and relationship. And in later versions, and in the most complex version of path goal theory, they actually get 8 different dimensions. I didn't go into that today because that gets so complex. That's for a very advanced level of study for path goal theory. And so if you find you're like, really, this is like, I'm all about this, I love where this is going, I encourage you to read up on it. And then maybe you can get to the full level of think about like the 8 different dimensions. And maybe that's something that you want to explore. But keeping it to 4 allows us to really focus in on it. And that's the earlier versions and probably the most common version of path goal theory that gets discussed. But again, a lot of theories around leadership are really going to look at the leadership approach really based on the task that's being done, like how tasky you are and how much relation time you put into relationship building. And it focuses on those two continua. Pathfinder theory goes beyond that, and that is a real strength for it. It's also a challenge, and we'll talk about that, but it's a strength. It has that theoretical framework for how leaders' behavior impacts followers' performance and motivation. Again, that's something that is unique about path goal theory, is it directly applies and looks at expectancy theory, a theory of motivation. It's not just abstract, it's looking at other theory. And so that is a strength for applying it. It does allow for a tailoring of the leadership style to the task at hand and the followers working on that task. And so it has that flexibility piece that you don't see in contingency theory. You can really look at, do I need to be really directive in this situation, or do you need to be really supportive? What can I do to help the followers get to their goals, right? Again, it's unique. I mentioned expectancy theory. And then in some ways, it has a very practical model for how you lead, right? And we showed the more complex kind of modeling of behaviors and styles and things like that. But it also has this other visualization that I included at the bottom of how path goal theory works. And again, it's very on the nose for the name, but the idea is that your role as the leader is to help discuss and clarify goals and objectives with your followers, and then you set them on that path and do everything you can to remove obstacles from their way so they can reach their goals. Whether that's through being directive, supportive, participative, or achievement-oriented, those four things help remove obstacles and improve motivation so that they can reach their goal. And so in some ways, there's a lot of practicality to that. However, there are also some things about the theory that have some challenge that may make it difficult to implement. And so in practice, path goal theory can be really complex and confusing to try and implement. As you're trying to map out 4 different approaches, characteristics of the individuals, context of the situation, to try and map that out on a day in, day out basis with each individual person you may be leading, that can be really confusing and complex. And so you have to be really functioning at a very high level and do a lot of study and a lot of time investment into path goal theory for it to be functional. The theory itself has only been partially supported through research. And we say partially because most of the research that's been conducted has focused on the directive and the supportive leadership dimensions. Now, as we mentioned, one of the strengths of this theory is it has 4 full dimensions. And as you really expand it out into the most complex versions, 8 different dimensions of leadership in those approaches, almost all of the research only focuses on the 2 most common ones that leadership theory focuses on: the task that needs to be completed and how much you're building a relationship and rapport with the followers, and along those 2 continua. And so as they introduce participative and achievement-oriented styles, there's not been a lot of research to confirm the validity or the utility of those styles. There's not a really great description or of why certain leadership styles and motivations go together and lead to success. And so there's not a lot of explanation on why a directive leadership style is really helpful for an ambiguous task, right? If you think about it from, the 30,000 foot perspective of, what seems like common sense, yep, providing a lot of directive leadership. If there's a really ambiguous task, that's going to be successful. That is something that makes good sense. But there isn't a lot of research behind it to show that that's why that's going to be successful. And the other sections have even less of a clear connection. Finally, the positive action is heavily focused on the leader in this theory. The idea that to be successful in any given situation, the leader is the one that has to carry the ball forward and adjust the approach, remove the obstacles. It's a lot of all positive action happens from that leader's perspective. It doesn't really give the follower much agency. And so that's problematic in that recognizing that, our followers are humans with their own set of skills and developments and talents they bring to the table. Path goal theory kind of puts them into a much more subjugated category. But also, if applied very heavily, there is some suggestion that path goal theory will make employees and followers actually less self-reliant. They will look to the leader to remove the obstacles consistently if done too much. And so it removes their agency potentially. And so it has to be kind of something you balance. So that is now actually all three theories fully covered. I know we're a little bit over on time, so thanks for sticking with me on that. I will move to questions as we move into the next section for anything folks want to do. But what I do want to really quickly cover is just what is coming next and how are we doing with all of this, right? And what can you do as next steps and actions, right? So we've talked about 3 potential theories that you can apply. And obviously you can't get everything you need from my session today in an hour and some change in order to effectively use these. What I recommend is if these things ring true with you, you're wanting to explore leadership, the first step is you really need to seek out a professional mentor that can help you explore that. You can also attend a Strengths Finder session through UTEP. Those can be led by faculty, staff, and student groups. If you request those through UTEP Edge, they will help set up a session for that. And if you have questions about how to do that, feel free to email me and I'll drop my email in the chat for folks that want to look into that for your student group or maybe your department if you work in a department. I encourage you to look for other leadership-oriented events through maybe the SCLC, through Mind Tracker. And then we do have another session on leadership coming up, and that'll be on February 15th. So we have our 4-part series. We'll do 2 more at the end in spring. And on the 15th, we're going to discuss leader-member exchange theory, transformational leadership, the leadership challenge model, and authentic leadership. So we're going to try and get those different theories in. We'll see if we can get all 4. We might have to cut one for time. But this is moving us from some of the more practical, like model-based, to some more philosophical, broad approaches to leadership, which is really interesting. And so if you're excited about the idea of looking at a more philosophical approach to leadership and what that looks like, come back and join us for that February 15th session. We'd be happy to have you there. With that, I want to say thank you, everyone, for being here today and engaging with us in the leadership session. I'm going to open the floor for any questions that folks might have. If there's no questions, feel free to go about your day. And thank you very much.